They say the hardest job is the night shift, when the whole world is asleep and you're forced to stay awake in the echoing silence. Your mind starts to play tricks on you. I never believed that. I was a medical student, a pragmatist to the core. I needed a part-time job, and the night shifts as an orderly in the old wing of the city hospital seemed perfect. Quiet, calm, and it paid well. How wrong I was about the calm part. The old wing was almost decommissioned. Long, dimly lit corridors, walls with peeling paint, and a persistent smell of antiseptic and oblivion. I was assigned to Ward 7. My colleague on the previous shift, an elderly orderly with tired eyes, seemed nervous as he handed things over. "It's simple here," he said, pointing to the only occupied bed in the ward. "One patient, doesn't talk, doesn't move. Just make sure his IV drip doesn't run out. And most importantly," he lowered his voice, "never turn off the nightlight. Whatever happens, this room must never be in total darkness. He doesn't like it." I looked at the bed. On it lay a person wrapped head to toe in thick bandages, like a mummy. Only small slits were left for breathing. There was no name, no medical history on the chart, just patient, Ward 7. "What's wrong with him?" I asked. "Burns," the orderly said curtly. "Don't ask too many questions. Just watch the light." He left, and I was alone. The ward was almost completely silent, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor and the soft rustle of my footsteps. I sat down at a small desk, pulled out a textbook, and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I constantly felt a gaze upon me, a gaze from the bandaged figure. It was irrational. He had no eyes, only bandages. But the feeling was so intense that shivers ran down my spine. Time dragged on painfully slowly. After midnight, I started noticing odd things. First, I saw the blanket on the patient shift slightly, though there was no draft or movement in the ward. I went over and adjusted it. The arms under the blanket were cold and hard, like a mannequin's. Then I heard the sound. It was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the ward, it was deafening. From under the bandages, where the patient's mouth should have been, came a quiet, distorted scraping, like radio static. I listened closely. In that static, I started to imagine fragments of words, of voices, but I couldn't make out a single one. I told myself it was just my imagination, fatigue. But it got worse with each passing night. Objects began to move. A pen left on the desk would end up on the floor. My textbook, which I had left on my left, I would find on my right. And the radio static from under the bandages grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes I thought the creature beneath them was mimicking the beep of the heart monitor. The climax came on the 5th night. A thunderstorm was raging outside. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howled in the old frames, and of course, at the most tense moment, the power in the hospital went out. I froze in absolute darkness. The orderly's words, "This room must never be in total darkness," rang in my head like an alarm bell. In a panic, I started fumbling on the desk for my phone or any source of light. The heart monitor had gone silent too. The only sound in the room now was my own ragged pulse. And then I heard it. A clear, loud sound of tearing fabric. It was coming from the bed. He was ripping off his bandages. I stopped breathing. I could hear the strips of cloth falling to the floor, one by one. Then everything went quiet. The most terrifying silence of my life. I couldn't hear footsteps or breathing. Nothing. It was as if no one else was in the room. My fingers found a lighter in my pocket. With a trembling hand, I flicked the wheel. A tiny flame snatched a piece of the ward from the darkness. I slowly turned it toward the bed. And I saw empty, discarded bandages lying on the sheet in the shape of a human body. The bed was empty. The patient was gone. I released a breath of relief mixed with confusion. He had escaped. I had to raise the alarm. I ran out into the dark corridor. "Help!" I tried to shout. "The patient from Ward 7 has escaped!" But not a sound came from my mouth. I opened my mouth, strained my vocal cords, but only a silent rasp came out. Panic began to choke me. I brought a hand to my throat to see what was wrong, and my fingers met not skin. They met rough, dry fabric. In horror, I began to feel my face. It was covered in bandages. The same thick, multi-layered bandages as the patient. I ran to the nurse's station, staring into the dark screen of a turned-off monitor, which acted as a black mirror. In the reflection, I saw a figure completely wrapped in bandages. Myself. And then I understood everything. The patient wasn't a person. It was an empty shell, a trap. And when the lights went out, it didn't escape. It changed clothes. It took my body, my skin, my voice, and left me here in this silent, bandaged prison. At that moment, the emergency lights in the corridor flickered on. Dim red lamps bathed everything in a sinister glow. And I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the hallway. He was in my clothes with my face. He looked at me, and his smile blossomed on my face. Then he turned and walked calmly toward the hospital exit. They found me an hour later. They assumed I was the patient, that I had simply fallen out of bed during the power outage. They couldn't hear my silent mental screams. They couldn't see the terror in my eyes, hidden beneath the bandages. They lifted me up and placed me back on the bed in Ward 7. They turned on the nightlight, and they left me alone. So I lie here, in this bandaged body, in this ringing silence. I can't move. I can't speak. All I can do is wait. Wait for the next night orderly to arrive, and hope that one night the power in the hospital will go out again.
A young adult male voice. It's always about hope. Hope for a new life, for a clean slate. I desperately needed a slate like that. After a difficult divorce, I was looking for the cheapest place I could find, just somewhere to weather the storm. And that's how I found this apartment. A small, old one-room flat on the top floor of a shabby building, with windows that faced the blank wall of the building next door. It was perfect. The landlady, an elderly woman with anxious eyes, seemed eager to get rid of the place. She quickly showed me the rooms, and as we stood in the hallway, she pointed to an inconspicuous door next to the entrance. "That's the closet," she said. "You can store your things in there. There's just one condition, a very important one." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts. "Never turn off the light in there. The bulb must stay on. Always, day and night." I looked at her, surprised. "Why? That's an extra electricity cost." "Just don't turn it off," she cut in, avoiding my eyes. "It's the main rule of this house." I didn't argue. I figured the old woman had her quirks, or maybe the wiring was so old it could short out. I paid her for a month in advance, and after handing me the keys, she almost ran down the stairwell. I spent the first few days settling in, arranging my few pieces of furniture, getting used to the creak of the floorboards and the hum of the old refrigerator. I tried to keep the closet door shut so the dim yellow light from inside wouldn't bother me, but I followed the rule. The light stayed on. The strangeness began about a week later. One night, I woke up to get a drink of water. Walking through the dark corridor, I noticed a strip of light under the closet door. And something else. The door was slightly ajar. I was absolutely certain I had closed it before going to bed. I blamed it on a draft. I walked over and shut the door firmly. But as I was heading back to my room, I thought I heard a sound. A quiet, deep, rhythmic sound coming from behind the closet door. The sound of someone else breathing. I froze. My heart sank. I was alone in the apartment. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. "I'm just imagining things," I whispered to myself, trying to stop shaking. I went back to bed, but I couldn't fall asleep that night. The next night, it happened again. I woke up and saw that the closet door was ajar. And again, I heard that quiet, steady breathing. This time, I was sure I wasn't going crazy. Someone was in there. I assumed a homeless person had gotten in, or that someone had a copy of the key. The following night, I bolted the closet door from the hallway side. I went to bed feeling secure, but in the middle of the night, a loud, sharp click woke me up. I sat up in bed and saw that the closet door was ajar again, the bolt torn from its fixture and lying on the floor. And the breathing? It was louder now, closer, as if whoever was in there had moved right up to the doorway. In the morning, I called the landlady. I told her about the broken bolt, about the breathing. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. "Did you turn off the light?" she finally asked, in a quiet, frightened voice. "No," I answered. "I promised I wouldn't." "Then just ignore it, and don't try to lock him in. He doesn't like that." Then she hung up. I was on the verge of panic. Who was he? What was happening in this apartment? That night, I decided to conduct an experiment. I decided to break the main rule. I walked up to the closet door. It was ajar, as usual. The breathing was distinct. I reached for the light switch next to the door, squeezed my eyes shut, and flicked it. The light in the closet went out, and in that same instant, the breathing stopped. absolute silence fell. I stood in the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. Nothing. I exhaled. Maybe it was just a short in the old wiring that was making the sound. I was about to turn the light back on when I heard a new sound. A shuffle. A quiet, slow, shuffling step. It came from the darkness of the closet. Then another. Someone was slowly walking out. Terrified, I scrambled back and flicked the switch on. The light in the closet flared back to life, and the footsteps stopped. I peeked inside. The closet was empty, just cluttered with some old junk. No one. But I noticed something. On the dusty floor, right at the threshold, was a single footprint. The print of a boot. Exactly like mine. I spent the next night without sleep. The door was ajar. The breathing had returned. I realized there was a direct connection between the light and whatever was in there. The light was somehow containing it, and the darkness was setting it free. I had to know who or what it was. I decided I had to film it. In the early 2000s, digital cameras were a rarity, but I had an old camcorder that recorded on tapes. It had a night vision mode. So that night, I set the camera up on a tripod in the hallway, aimed directly at the slightly open closet door. I made sure the light switch was visible in the frame. Then I pressed record, walked to the door, turned off the light, and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I sat in the darkness and listened. The shuffling sound started. Slow, hesitant. It continued for about a minute, then fell silent. I waited for another hour before I dared to go out. I turned the light in the closet back on, grabbed the camera, and with trembling hands put the tape into the VCR. I pressed play. At first, the screen just showed the dark hallway and the strip of light from the closet. Then my own hand enters the frame, flicks the switch. Darkness. The night vision mode kicks in, and the image becomes grainy and green. And then I see it. Movement. From the darkness of the closet, a figure emerges. Very slowly. It's a man. He's wearing the same clothes as me. He has the same haircut. He turns, and I see his face. It was me. But not quite. He looked older, tired. There were deep lines on his face that I didn't have, and his eyes were filled with a profound, soul-crushing despair. He took a few shuffling steps into the hallway, looked around the empty apartment with an utter look of confusion, and then he looked directly at the camera. He looked at me. His expression wasn't threatening. It was pleading. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no sound came out. Then he slowly, reluctantly, turned and shuffled back into the darkness of the closet, disappearing from view. The tape ended. I sat there, frozen, the hum of the VCR filling the silence. I finally understood. The thing in the closet wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was me, a future me, trapped in some kind of time loop, forced to live in that dark closet, only able to emerge for a few moments when the light was out. The warning from the landlady wasn't to protect me from him. It was to protect him from the outside world. But why? What had happened to him? What had he done to end up there? Then a new, more terrifying thought struck me. This older, broken version of me, he came out of the closet, but he always went back in. which meant I was the one who was going to become him. My future was already written. One day, for some reason, I will walk through that door, and an older, more tired version of me will be sitting in this very chair, watching a grainy, green video of a man who looks just like him taking his first shuffling steps into the hallway.
I've always loved silence. That's why the job of a night watchman at the long-closed Epic department store seemed perfect for me. A huge, echoing building frozen in time. Long rows of counters covered in sheets, escalators stopped halfway, and a complete, absolute silence. My job was simple. Make my rounds every hour and make sure no one broke in. There was just one strange point in the instructions left for me by the previous watchman, an old man who was retiring. It concerned the main showroom on the first floor, the hall where a collection of old wax mannequins dressed in the fashion of the 60s still stood. "They are the most valuable asset," he had said, handing me the keys. "Just walk past them, and," he hesitated for a moment, "never touch them. Don't try to fix their clothes or change their pose. Never." I thought at the time that they were just old and fragile exhibits. On the very first night, I understood what he meant. The mannequin hall was the creepiest place in the building. Dozens of figures frozen in unnatural, theatrical poses, a woman laughing with her head thrown back, a man pointing a finger into the void, a child who had dropped a toy ball. Their faces were incredibly realistic, but their glass, lifeless eyes seemed to follow my every move. The beam of my flashlight would catch their wax smiles in the darkness, and it sent shivers down my spine. The strangeness began on the third or fourth night. At first, it was little things, easy to dismiss as tricks of the imagination. It seemed to me that the head of one of the mannequins, a man in a hat, was turned a little more than it had been yesterday. The next day, I noticed that the fingers of another, previously clenched in a fist, were now relaxed. I convinced myself that I just hadn't remembered their exact poses. But the tension grew. Sometimes, as I walked past them in complete silence, I would hear a faint sound, like the cracking of old wax, as if something was moving very slowly beneath their still skin. One day, while checking the administrative offices, I found the previous watchman's old logbook in a desk drawer. The last few pages were filled with trembling, broken handwriting. He wrote about the mannequins. He was convinced they weren't just dolls, but vessels, that they held the last most powerful emotions of the people who once wore their clothes: joy, anger, despair. "They are sleeping," one entry read. "The most important thing is not to disturb their peace. You must not touch them. Movement is awakening." After reading that, I became truly afraid of that hall. I made my rounds, trying to stay as far away from the frozen figures as possible, illuminating them for a fraction of a second. The climax came on a cold November night. I was on my 3 a.m. round. As I entered the main hall, I immediately felt that something was wrong. I shone my flashlight around, and my heart plummeted. One of the mannequins, a figure of a crying woman in an elegant dress, was not in its place. Just a little, half a step forward from its pedestal, but I knew for certain that yesterday it had been standing on it. I froze, not knowing what to do. The old man's warning echoed in my head: never touch them. But the thought that this wax figure had moved on its own was even more terrifying. I decided I had to fix it.
Maybe I had accidentally bumped it last night and hadn't noticed. I had to put everything back in its place. With trembling hands, I approached the mannequin. The wax was cold and unpleasant to the touch. I placed my hands on its shoulders and with an effort pushed it back onto its pedestal. The moment its feet touched their proper place, a sound echoed through the vast, empty hall. It wasn't a scream or a moan. It was a quiet but distinct, multi-voiced exhale, as if dozens of people who had been holding their breath all released it at once. And in that same second, all the lights in the department store flickered and died. I was left in absolute, ringing darkness. I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed with terror. It felt like an eternity. Then, with a loud click, the dim emergency lights came on. Red lamps flooded the hall with a bloody light. I slowly raised my eyes, and I screamed. All the other mannequins in the hall, dozens of figures, had turned. Their wax heads, their glass eyes, were now all pointed directly at me. The man in the hat, the laughing woman, the child with the ball, all of them were looking at me. There was no longer anything theatrical in their frozen poses. There was only menace. I understood my terrible mistake. The mannequins weren't locked away, they were sleeping. And the one I had touched wasn't just a doll, it was their keeper, their shepherd, the only one that had to remain motionless to contain the others. And I, by disturbing its peace, had awakened the entire collection. The last thing I saw in the red twilight was movement. Slow, unnatural, with a horrifying creak of old wax and joints, they began to step down from their pedestals. Slowly, jerkily, turning their heads, they were moving towards me from all sides. They didn't hurry. They had nowhere to rush. They were just walking to take their places around a new exhibit. They needed a new keeper.